The silence that told the truth. There are moments in an investigation where absence speaks louder than presence, where what doesn't happen becomes more significant than what does, where silence, when it should be deafening, instead settles into the room like something expected, anticipated. The ransom note promised a phone call between 8 and 10 a.m. It was specific about this. Clear. I will call you. Not might, not possibly, will. And yet when those hours passed and the phone stayed silent, when the promised moment came and went without the contact that was supposed to determine JonBenet's fate, something strange happened. Or rather, something strange didn't happen. The house didn't erupt in fresh panic. There was no escalation, no desperate demands for the police to do something, anything, now that the kidnappers had broken their promise. Just waiting, continued waiting, as though the silence itself was part of the script, as though nobody was truly surprised that the phone never rang. Theme 1. The morning that refused to break. Let's walk through what should have happened that morning. The note was discovered around 5:30 a.m. Police arrived shortly after. By 6 a.m., the house was filling with people, friends, victim advocates, detectives, family. And everyone was operating under the same premise. JonBenet was with kidnappers who would call between 8 and 10 a.m. to give instructions for her return. That phone call was the focal point. The moment everything had been building toward, the hinge upon which her safety depended. So as 8 a.m. approached, what should we have seen? Intense focus. Everyone gathered near the phone, the house quiet, waiting. Officers prepared with recording equipment, the family positioned to answer, perhaps with police coaching them on what to say, how to keep the kidnappers on the line long enough to trace the call, how to sound compliant without agreeing to anything that would put JonBenet in more danger. This should have been the most critical 2-hour window of the entire day. Every second of it should have been charged with anticipation and dread. But that's not quite what happened. Or rather, that's not all that happened. Because while people were ostensibly waiting for the call, life in that house continued in ways that seem strange when you really think about them. People moved between rooms, conversations occurred. There was this odd ambient quality to the waiting. Not the frozen, breath-held anticipation you'd expect when a child's life hangs on a phone ringing, but something more diffuse, more scattered, as though people were going through the motions of waiting without truly believing the call would come. Let's think about this from multiple angles, because the strangeness only becomes visible when we examine what waiting actually looks like, psychologically and physiologically, when the stakes are life and death. From a logical standpoint, if you believe your child is with dangerous people who have explicitly threatened her life, and those people have promised to call you with instructions, your entire being becomes oriented toward that phone. You don't leave the room it's in. You don't engage in other activities. You don't let yourself be distracted by anything. Because missing that call, or not being ready when it comes, could mean losing your child forever. The call is everything. It's the only path forward. Without it, you're stuck in limbo, unable to act, unable to save her, unable to do anything but wait and hope. So what does it mean when the waiting doesn't look like that? When there's movement and conversation and activity that suggests people's attention isn't singularly focused on that phone? It means one of two things. Either the people in that house were so traumatized, so overwhelmed, that they couldn't maintain focus, which would be understandable but would also manifest as chaos, breakdown, visible distress, or they weren't really waiting for a call they believed would come. They were waiting for time to pass, for the window to close, for the moment when the fiction of the ransom note would start to break down and everyone would have to face what that meant. Philosophically, there's something profound about the performance of waiting. When you wait for something you truly expect, your body and mind are oriented toward the future. You're living in anticipation. Every moment is colored by the approaching event. Time feels distorted, sometimes crawling, sometimes lurching forward, because you're not fully present. You're mentally reaching toward what's coming. But when you're waiting for something you don't actually expect, the waiting becomes performative. You have to remember to check the clock. You have to remind yourself to look concerned about the time passing. You have to engage in the behaviors that signal I'm waiting for an important call. Staying near the phone, keeping the line clear, appearing anxious about the deadline, without the genuine emotional investment that would make those behaviors automatic. And that's what we need to examine. Was the waiting in the Ramsey house that morning authentic, or was it performative? Were people genuinely oriented toward that phone call as the critical moment that would determine JonBenet's fate? Or were they performing the role of people waiting for a call, while knowing on some level that the performance was all there was? That the call wasn't coming because there was no one to make it? Psychologically, genuine anticipation has a signature. It creates a specific kind of mental state. You're hypervigilant. Your attention is narrowed. You startle at unexpected sounds. You can't engage deeply with anything else because some part of your mind is always tracking toward the anticipated event. And when that event has life or death stakes, when it's a call from kidnappers who have your child, that mental state intensifies to the point where it becomes all-consuming. You can't think about anything else. You can't focus on mundane details. Your entire consciousness is oriented toward that phone. But that level of focused anticipation is exhausting to maintain. And it's nearly impossible to fake convincingly. Because if you're not genuinely anticipating the event, if you don't truly believe it's coming, your attention will wander. You'll engage in other activities. You'll have conversations that don't directly relate to the crisis. You'll demonstrate behaviors that signal your mind is elsewhere, that you're not actually in that state of hypervigilant waiting. So when we look at accounts of the Ramsey house that morning, we need to ask, what do the behaviors tell us? Do they match the psychology of parents desperately waiting for a call that will determine whether their child lives? Or do they match something else? The psychology of people going through motions, performing a script, waiting for time to pass rather than waiting for a specific event they believe will happen. From a physiological perspective, anticipation does specific things to the body. Your heart rate elevates, your muscles tense, your breathing becomes shallow. Stress hormones flood your system. You might feel nauseated, lightheaded, jittery. And those physical responses aren't easily controlled. They're autonomic. Your body responds to perceived threat whether you want it to or not. So if the people in that house truly believed JonBenet was with kidnappers and truly believed the phone call was coming, their bodies should have been showing signs of acute stress throughout that 8 to 10 a.m. window. They should have appeared physically tense, visibly anxious, possibly on the verge of breaking down. Because the body doesn't lie about fear. It doesn't know how to perform calm when genuine terror is present. But if they appeared relatively composed, if they were able to engage in conversations, move around the house, maintain some semblance of normal interaction, that tells us something about their physiological state. It tells us the acute fear response wasn't fully activated, which means either they were somehow managing to suppress it, which would be unusual and would likely manifest in other ways like rigid posture or forced calm, or the fear wasn't as acute as it should have been because on some level they knew there was no immediate danger. Because they knew the call wasn't coming. Because they knew JonBenet wasn't with kidnappers who would be calling to make demands. Forensic criminology teaches us to look at behavior in context. And the context here is crucial. In genuine kidnapping cases where a ransom call is expected, investigators see very specific patterns of behavior. Families cluster around the phone. They maintain silence in the room so they won't miss the ring. They coordinate with police about who will answer, what will be said, how to keep the kidnappers engaged. They're focused, intense, desperate. Time stops for them during that window. Nothing else matters except that call. So we need to compare what happened in the Ramsey house to that baseline. Did the behavior match what investigators typically see in ransom situations? Or was there a disconnect? Behaviors that suggested people were going through the motions without the underlying urgency that should have driven those motions? From an anthropological perspective, crisis creates specific social dynamics. When a family is under acute threat, they tend to physically cluster. They seek proximity to each other. They create a tight circle of support and shared vigilance. There's a pulling inward, a circling of the wagons, because in crisis, the family unit becomes the primary source of safety and comfort. But there are other dynamics at play in the Ramsey house that morning. Legal representation was already present, creating a different kind of dynamic, one that involves boundaries, management, control. Friends and neighbors were there, which suggests a more diffuse social structure rather than the tight family clustering you'd expect in acute crisis. There was movement between rooms, which suggests people weren't maintaining that tight physical proximity that usually characterizes families waiting for critical news. All of this tells us something about the social reality in that house. It wasn't organized around desperate, unified anticipation of the phone call. It was organized around something else, managing the situation, maintaining appearances, waiting for time to pass. Finally, let's consider this from the perspective of someone who knows something they shouldn't know. If you've written a ransom note that promises a phone call, but you know no call is coming because you wrote the note yourself, how do you behave during the time window when the call is supposed to happen? You have to perform anticipation. You have to seem like you're waiting. But you're actually just waiting for time to pass, for the window to close, for the moment when you can legitimately say the kidnappers didn't call. Something must have gone wrong. And then the investigation shifts to trying to figure out why the kidnappers didn't follow through rather than questioning whether there were ever kidnappers at all. That's strategic waiting. It serves a purpose. It maintains the fiction for as long as possible. But it doesn't look quite the same as genuine waiting. Because genuine waiting is focused and intense and all-consuming. Strategic waiting is more measured, more controlled, more patient. And patience in a moment when your child's life supposedly hangs on a phone call is revealing. Because you can only be patient when you know the outcome won't be catastrophic. When you know that even though the call isn't coming, it doesn't mean what everyone else thinks it means. It doesn't mean the kidnappers changed their minds or something went wrong. It just means you've reached the end of this particular phase of the fiction you've created. And now you move to the next phase. We've circled through this from every angle: logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and from the perspective of someone managing a crisis they created themselves. And what emerges is a picture of waiting that doesn't quite fit, waiting that seems performed rather than genuine, waiting that suggests people going through motions rather than experiencing authentic anticipation, waiting that makes sense only if you accept that maybe, just maybe, nobody in that house truly expected the phone to ring. Because they already knew it wouldn't. Because they understood on some level that the ransom note was a fiction, and the phone call was never going to materialize because there were no kidnappers to make it. The morning refused to break the way it should have. The critical moment came and started to pass, and the house just continued. Waiting. Not with the intensity you'd expect, but with something more like resignation. Like people marking time. And that difference between desperate anticipation and resigned patience tells us more about what was really happening in that house than almost anything else. Theme 2. When the deadline passed and nothing changed. 10 a.m. came, and the phone didn't ring. Think about what that moment should have meant. For 2 hours, everyone had been waiting for contact from the kidnappers. The ransom note had explicitly promised that they would call. And that promise was the foundation of everything. It was what made the kidnapping seem real, what gave everyone hope that JonBenet would be returned safely. what provided a framework for how to respond to the crisis. When that promise was broken, when 10 a.m. passed and the call didn't come, the entire framework should have collapsed. Because now you're not operating in a scenario you understand anymore. The kidnappers aren't following their own timeline, they're not keeping their word. And that unpredictability should be terrifying, because if they're not doing what they said they would do, what are they doing? Are they hurting JonBenet because the family called the police despite the note's warnings? Have they changed their minds about the ransom? Are they panicking? What's happening out there, wherever they are, and why haven't they made contact? Those questions should have been urgent, pressing, desperate. The failure of the kidnappers to call should have been treated as a crisis within the crisis, a fundamental shift in the situation that required immediate response, new strategies, escalated action. But that's not what happened. Or rather, that's not how it was treated. Instead, there was this strange continuation. The waiting just continued. People stayed in the house. The police remained in information-gathering mode. There was no dramatic escalation, no breakdown, no demands for radical action now that the expected contact hadn't materialized. Just an extension of the waiting, as though everyone understood that the phone call not coming was somehow acceptable, somehow within the range of expected outcomes, even though logically it should have been devastating. Let's think about what that tells us. Let's examine the moment when the deadline passed and try to understand what it reveals about what people in that house really believed. Logically, the failure of the kidnappers to call should have been the moment when the investigation shifted dramatically. Because at that point, you're no longer in a kidnapping scenario that's following a predictable pattern. You're in unknown territory. And unknown territory is terrifying. It means anything could be happening. It means all your assumptions about how this would unfold are wrong. It means your child is in a situation you don't understand with people who aren't following their own stated plan. A parent in that situation should be breaking down, should be demanding answers, should be begging police to do something. Search the neighborhood more thoroughly, set up roadblocks, call in additional resources, anything that might increase the chances of finding JonBenet before it's too late. Because the clock is ticking and every hour that passes without contact from the kidnappers is an hour where her situation could be deteriorating. But we don't see that kind of desperate escalation. We see patience, continued patience, a willingness to keep waiting even though the promised contact hasn't happened. And that patience is strange. It's inconsistent with what parents should feel when the one thread they were holding on to, the promise of a phone call, turns out to be empty. Unless they weren't really holding on to that thread. Unless they knew it was never substantial to begin with. Unless the phone call not coming wasn't surprising because it had never been expected in the first place. Philosophically, let's think about the nature of broken promises. When someone promises you something and fails to deliver, your trust in them breaks. Your belief in the narrative they've given you shatters. You start questioning everything they've told you. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? If the phone call isn't happening, maybe the whole kidnapping story is false. Maybe nothing they've said can be trusted. That questioning should have happened at 10 a.m. when the phone didn't ring. The ransom note's credibility should have been shattered. Police should have immediately started considering alternative scenarios. That the note was fake, that JonBenet never left the house, that this wasn't an external kidnapping at all. Because when the kidnappers don't follow through on their explicit promise, the most logical conclusion is that there are no kidnappers. That the note was written by someone else for some other purpose. But that shift in thinking doesn't seem to have happened immediately. The investigation continued to operate under the assumption that the kidnapping was real, that the kidnappers existed, that they had simply changed their plan for reasons unknown. The broken promise wasn't treated as evidence that the entire premise was false. It was treated as a complication within a scenario that was still basically accepted as real. And that's revealing. because it suggests that either the investigation wasn't thinking critically enough about what the broken promise meant, or the family's behavior was convincing enough to maintain the kidnapping narrative even after its central premise, the phone call, had failed to materialize. Either way, the moment when the deadline passed should have been more significant than it was. Should have prompted more questioning, more doubt, more fundamental re-examination of what was really happening. Psychologically, when you're waiting for something desperately and it doesn't happen, you go through stages. First, there's confusion. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you got the time wrong. Then there's desperation. Maybe it's still coming. Maybe you just need to wait a little longer. Then there's anger. They promised. How could they break that promise? What does this mean? And finally, there's a kind of collapse. The realization that what you were hoping for isn't going to happen and you need to figure out what to do now. Those stages should have been visible in the Ramsey house after 10 a.m. You should have seen John and Patsy cycling through confusion, desperation, anger, despair. You should have seen visible deterioration in their emotional state as the minutes ticked by without contact. Because that's what happens when hope is deferred and then extinguished. People break. They can't hold it together through that kind of disappointment when the stakes are their child's life. But accounts of that morning don't describe that kind of breakdown. They describe continued waiting, continued presence in the house, continued engagement with police and friends. Not the emotional collapse you'd expect when the one thing you were holding on to, the promise of contact, the hope of getting your child back through following the kidnapper's instructions, proves to be false. And that stability, that absence of breakdown, is worth examining, because it suggests either incredible emotional control under impossible circumstances, or it suggests that the disappointment wasn't as acute as it should have been, that the phone call not coming wasn't as devastating as it would be if you truly believed your child's safety depended on it. That maybe on some level the waiting had never been about expecting the call. It had been about waiting for the timeline to play out so everyone could move to the next phase. From a physiological standpoint, disappointment this profound should trigger visible stress responses. Elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, possible hyperventilation, tears, shaking. The body's response to having hope extinguished is powerful and difficult to control. It's not something you can easily mask or manage in the moment. So if the people in that house appeared relatively composed after 10 a.m. passed, if they continued to engage in conversations, make decisions, interact with others without visible physical breakdown, that tells us something about their physiological state. Either they were in shock, which would manifest in numbness and disconnection, or they weren't experiencing the acute disappointment that should come when kidnappers fail to call. Because their bodies weren't responding as though something catastrophic had just happened. They were responding as though this was an expected development, something they were prepared for, something that didn't fundamentally change the situation. Forensic criminology gives us comparison points. In other ransom cases where promised contact doesn't happen, investigators see families falling apart. They see people becoming frantic, demanding action, losing their ability to maintain composure. Because the failure of the kidnappers to follow through is experienced as a threat to the victim's life. It signals danger, unpredictability, potential violence, and that signal creates panic. So when we compare the Ramsey case to those baseline behaviors, we have to ask, why didn't we see that same level of panic? Why was there this strange patience, this willingness to continue waiting even though the framework for understanding the situation had just collapsed? What allowed people in that house to remain relatively composed when they should have been breaking down? The answer that makes the most sense is that the phone call not coming wasn't experienced as the catastrophic event it should have been. Because it wasn't surprising. Because on some level it was expected. Because maybe the people in that house understood that the phone was never going to ring because there were no kidnappers to make the call. The deadline passing just meant you'd reach the end of this particular fiction and would need to figure out how to handle what came next. From an anthropological perspective, let's think about how communities respond to failed promises in crisis situations. Typically, there's a rupture in trust. The person or group who broke the promise becomes suspect. Their motives are questioned. The community rallies around the victims and demands accountability. But in the Ramsey house, there was no community rallying against the kidnappers who had broken their promise. There was no anger directed outward at these people who had taken JonBenet and then failed to follow through on their stated plan. Instead, there was this inward-focused waiting, this continued presence in the house, this maintenance of the status quo even though the situation had fundamentally changed. That pattern makes sense if the kidnappers were always a fiction. If the outward-directed anger had nowhere to go because there was no external enemy. If the real crisis was internal, something that had happened in the house, something that needed to be managed and controlled and explained, then the phone call not coming would just be another piece of the fiction falling apart. Not something to be angry about, because anger would require believing the kidnappers were real in the first place. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone managing a situation they created. If you've written a ransom note that promises a phone call, you know from the moment you write it that the call isn't coming. You know 10 a.m. will pass without contact. You know the promised timeline will break down, so you prepare for that. You anticipate it. You think about how to respond when it happens. And your response needs to maintain the fiction for as long as possible. You can't acknowledge that the call not coming means there were never any kidnappers. You need to act confused, disappointed, worried that something went wrong with the kidnappers' plan. But you can't act so devastated that it becomes unmanageable. You can't break down completely because you need to maintain enough control to continue guiding the narrative, to continue managing how the investigation unfolds. So you perform disappointment, you perform concern, but you keep it contained. You stay composed enough to continue functioning, because you're not actually experiencing the acute devastation of having your last hope extinguished. You're experiencing something else. Maybe anxiety about how to handle this next phase, maybe fear about whether the fiction will hold, maybe guilt or denial or compartmentalization, but not the specific focused devastation of a parent whose child's fate depends on a phone call that didn't come. We've examined the moment when the deadline passed from every angle we can, and what emerges is a picture that doesn't quite fit the story we've been told. The phone call didn't come. And the response to that failure was too measured, too patient, too accepting. It didn't look like what should happen when kidnappers break their promise and a child's life hangs in the balance. It looked like something else, like people marking time, like people waiting for a fiction to play out long enough that when it finally collapsed, no one would question whether it had ever been real in the first place. But time has a way of revealing truth. And the longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to maintain the fiction that there were kidnappers out there somewhere, holding JonBenet, deciding what to do next. Because kidnappers who exist make contact. They follow through on their demands. They operate within the framework they've established because that framework is how they get what they want. Kidnappers who don't exist do none of those things. They don't call because they can't. They don't follow through because there's no one to follow through. They exist only on paper in the words of a ransom note written by someone who needed to create a story that would explain the unexplainable. And when the deadline passed and the phone stayed silent, that silence told the truth the note had tried to hide. There were no kidnappers. There never had been. And everyone waiting in that house for a call that would never come. At least some of them already knew it. Theme 3. The surveillance that wasn't watching. Let's come back to something the ransom note claimed. Not just the phone call, but the surveillance. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. You will be scanned for electronic devices. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. You stand a 99% chance of getting her back. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. The note is very clear about this. The house is being watched. The Ramseys are under surveillance. The kidnappers know what's happening. We'll know if police are called. We'll know if instructions aren't followed. The whole premise of the ransom note depends on this idea of omniscient criminals who can see everything the family does and will punish any deviation from their demands. So let's think about what happened in response to that stated surveillance. The note says, don't contact anyone. Don't call the police. Follow instructions exactly or JonBenet will be hurt. Those aren't suggestions, they're explicit threats backed by the claim that the kidnappers are watching and will know immediately if the family doesn't comply. And yet, within minutes of discovering the note, Patsy called 911. Police arrived. The house began filling with people. Friends, neighbors, victim advocates, detectives. By mid-morning, there were numerous people moving through the house, in and out, visible from outside. Impossible to hide from anyone who might actually be conducting surveillance. If the surveillance were real, if dangerous criminals were actually watching the house, this should have been catastrophic for JonBenet's safety. Every person who entered the house was a violation of the ransom note's demands. Every police car parked outside was visible evidence that the family hadn't followed instructions. According to the note's own logic, these violations should have resulted in immediate consequences. The kidnappers should have called to express their anger. They should have issued new threats. They should have taken action to punish the family's non-compliance. But none of that happened. The house filled with people and nothing changed. The surveillance that was supposed to be all-knowing either didn't notice or didn't care. And that disconnect between what the note claimed would happen and what actually happened should have told everyone something important. The surveillance wasn't real, because surveillance that doesn't respond to blatant violations isn't surveillance at all. Let's think about this logically. If you're a criminal who has kidnapped a child and you're serious about getting your ransom money, you establish control through fear. You make it clear that you're watching, that you know what the family is doing, that any deviation from your instructions will have consequences. And then, when deviations occur, because they always do, because people in crisis make mistakes or panic or decide to take risks, you follow through on your threats. You make contact. You remind the family that you're watching. You demonstrate that your surveillance is real by responding to what you've observed. That's how you maintain control in a kidnapping scenario. You prove that your threats aren't empty. You show that you have the knowledge and capability you claim to have. But the surveillance claimed in the ransom note never demonstrated itself. The house filled with police and friends, blatantly violating the note's instructions, and there was no response. No phone call expressing anger. No escalation of threats, no consequences for the family's non-compliance, just silence, as though the kidnappers who were supposedly watching couldn't actually see what was happening, or as though they didn't exist at all. From a philosophical standpoint, surveillance is about power and control. When you know you're being watched, it changes your behavior. You become more careful, more self-conscious, more aware of how your actions might be perceived. The threat of surveillance is often more powerful than actual surveillance because it forces people to police themselves, to assume they're being observed even when they're not. But that psychological effect only works if you believe the surveillance is real, and belief requires some kind of confirmation. You need evidence that someone is actually watching, that they can see what you're doing, that they're responding to your actions. Without that confirmation, the threat of surveillance becomes hollow. It's just words on a page with nothing to back them up. So when the Ramsey house filled with people and nothing happened, no response from the supposed watchers, no consequences for the violations, what should that have done to the family's belief in the surveillance? It should have shattered it. It should have made them realize that either the kidnappers weren't actually watching, or they weren't as dangerous as the note claimed, or they didn't exist at all. But there's no indication that anyone in the house reached that conclusion. The investigation continued to operate as though the kidnapping were real, as though the threats in the note were credible, even though the most basic claim, that the house was under surveillance and violations would bring consequences, had already been proven false by the lack of response to the massive violations occurring throughout the morning. Psychologically, cognitive dissonance should have been creating real problems for anyone who truly believed the ransom note, because you can't simultaneously believe that dangerous criminals are watching your house, and that those same criminals aren't responding to the obvious violations happening in full view. Those beliefs contradict each other. One or the other has to give way. So either people in the house were experiencing massive cognitive dissonance, believing the note while watching it be proven false, or they weren't really believing it in the first place. They were performing belief, going through the motions of treating the note as credible while understanding on some level that the surveillance wasn't real because the kidnappers weren't real, because the whole scenario was a fiction. From a physiological perspective, the fear of being watched should create specific responses. Hypervigilance, constant checking of windows, doors, the perimeter. Anxiety about being visible from outside. Lowered voices, drawn curtains, and awareness of being observed that manifests in cautious, self-conscious behavior. But if the people in the Ramsey house were acting relatively normally, moving through rooms, having conversations at normal volume, allowing numerous people to come and go visibly, that suggests they weren't experiencing the physiological fear response that comes with believing you're under hostile surveillance. Their bodies weren't responding as though there were dangerous people watching who might hurt JonBenet if they didn't behave carefully. They were responding as though the house was a space they could move through normally because there were no external eyes judging their actions. Forensic criminology teaches us to look for consistency between stated beliefs and behaviors. If someone claims to believe they're under surveillance but behaves as though they're not, that disconnect is significant. It suggests the stated belief isn't sincere, that they're performing belief for an audience, in this case, the police, while their actual behavior reveals they know there's no one watching. And that's what we see in the Ramsey house. The ransom note claims surveillance. The note is treated as though it's credible, but the behavior doesn't match what you'd see if people truly believed hostile actors were watching the house and would hurt JonBenet if instructions weren't followed. Instead, the behavior suggests people going about their interactions relatively normally, as though the surveillance threat was something to acknowledge verbally but not actually worry about behaviorally. From an anthropological perspective, surveillance shapes social space. When communities know they're being watched, they modify how they use space. They create private areas where surveillance can't penetrate. They develop codes and signals to communicate without being obvious. They become conscious of sightlines and visibility. But the Ramsey house that morning doesn't seem to have been organized around surveillance awareness. People moved freely. The front door was used normally. Windows weren't covered. There was no apparent effort to create private spaces or to communicate in ways that couldn't be observed. The house was used as though it were a normal space, not a space under hostile observation. And that use of space tells us something. It tells us that whatever people in that house believed about the ransom note, they didn't believe the surveillance threat was real. Because if they had, they would have modified their behavior and their use of space accordingly. The fact that they didn't suggests the surveillance was never taken seriously as an actual threat. It was words on paper that were acknowledged but not believed at the behavioral level where belief actually matters. Finally, let's think about this from the perspective of someone who wrote the ransom note and included the surveillance threat to make it seem more credible, more frightening. If you're trying to create the impression of organized, capable criminals, you claim omniscience. You claim to be watching. You threaten consequences for any deviation, because those threats create fear and compliance. But you don't actually have the ability to follow through on those threats. You're not watching the house. You can't see who comes and goes. You don't know what the family is doing, so when the family violates your instructions by calling police and filling the house with people, you can't respond. You can't make good on your threats. You just have to hope that nobody notices the disconnect, that nobody realizes the surveillance was fake because there are no kidnappers to conduct surveillance in the first place. And for a while, that hope seems to have been well-founded. The investigation continued to treat the ransom note as credible even though its most basic operational claim, surveillance that would respond to violations, had already been proven false. But that failure of the surveillance to manifest should have been one of the clearest early signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the kidnapping narrative. That the note wasn't what it claimed to be, that the whole scenario was constructed rather than real. We've circled through this from every angle, and what emerges is a pattern of claims that don't hold up to scrutiny. The note claims surveillance. The family and friends fill the house with people, blatantly violating the note's instructions. The supposed surveillance doesn't respond, no consequences follow. And yet everyone continues to act as though the note is credible, as though the threats are real, as though there are actually kidnappers out there watching and waiting. But surveillance that doesn't surveil isn't surveillance. Threats that don't materialize aren't real threats. And kidnappers who don't respond to massive violations of their explicit instructions aren't competent criminals. They're fiction. Words on a page designed to create fear and misdirection, but without any operational reality backing them up. The house wasn't being watched. It never had been. And the fact that it could fill with police and friends and investigators without any response from the supposed kidnappers should have told everyone right from the start that the surveillance was a lie, which meant the kidnappers were a lie, which meant the entire kidnapping scenario was something other than what it claimed to be. But lies have a way of being maintained through momentum. Once everyone starts operating under a premise, it takes significant evidence to shift that premise. And the evidence was there, in the silence of the phone that didn't ring, in the surveillance that didn't respond, in the deadline that passed without consequence. But seeing that evidence requires stepping back and asking, does any of this actually make sense? Do the behaviors match what we'd expect if the story were true? And when you ask those questions, when you really look at what happened and what didn't happen that morning, the answer becomes clear. The story didn't hold. The premise was false. And the silence of the phone, the silence of the supposed watchers, the silence where there should have been escalation and panic and consequence, that silence told the truth. There was no one out there. There never had been. The only people who knew what happened to JonBenet were already in the house, already waiting, already hoping that the fiction would hold long enough to point the investigation anywhere but toward them. The outro. We've walked through the morning of December 26th, watching the clock tick toward 10 a.m., watching the deadline approach and pass, watching the silence settle into that house where it should have been unbearable. We've seen how the phone call that was promised never came, how the surveillance that was claimed never manifested, how the consequences that were threatened never materialized. And we've seen how the response to all these failures was too calm, too patient, too accepting of a situation that should have been causing complete breakdown. The silence told the truth, the phone that didn't ring, the watchers who weren't watching, the deadline that passed without escalation. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The ransom note wasn't real. The kidnappers didn't exist. The whole scenario was a construction, a fiction designed to point the investigation away from what had really happened in that house. And someone in that house knew it. Someone understood why the phone would never ring, why the surveillance would never respond, why the promised timeline would fall apart. Because they'd written it. They'd created this elaborate fiction to buy time, to create distance, to make everyone look outward when the truth was internal. But fictions can only hold for so long. And the longer the silence lasted, the more obvious it became, to anyone willing to look closely, that there was no one on the other end of that silence. No criminals plotting their next move, no kidnappers deciding what to do. Just emptiness where the story claimed there should be danger. Next time, we'll look at what happened while everyone was waiting for that phone call. We'll examine the bowl of pineapple and the glass of tea. Evidence of a pause that should never have happened. Evidence of someone taking their time when they should have been rushing. Evidence of comfort in a moment when there should have been nothing but fear and urgency. Because while the house was supposedly under siege, while dangerous criminals were supposedly holding JonBenet and threatening her life, someone stopped to make a snack. And that pause, that inexplicable intermission, tells us something crucial about who was really in that house that night and what they knew about where JonBenet actually was.